Good morning. Welcome to our fifth installment of our virtual seminar, Grove. We're very excited to have you here. Want to do a special thank you and shout out to our sponsor, which is the Cedar City Bryan Head Tourism Bureau. The canyons are clean. There's no COVID hanging on that sagebrush. You can come down and visit us. And you want a taste of the festival? You can walk around these empty grounds. It's lovely. But here, we're talking about the work, and we're very excited about the guest and the conversation we're going to have today. Brian, who do we have with us here today?
Thank you, Michael, for that awesome introduction. And yes, we have an awesome guest today, someone I'm really excited to introduce. We have the amazing René Thornton Jr. is with us today, sporting his Shakespeare Nerd t-shirt, which I love. Giving a little props to Alex Allred, a former company member here at the festival, who's, well, René can give the pitch on Alex's Etsy, which is terrific. I love that illustration. But I'm thrilled to have René here today. Thank you for being here. René has one of the most amazing achievements in his pedigree as an actor, in that he has completed all of Shakespeare's plays, or what, and we'll get into what the definition of really what that is, because it's not all of Shakespeare's plays, but those in the first folio and a couple others outside it, which is an amazing achievement, as any professional in this industry knows. It's just the idea of completing 36 to 38 of Shakespeare's plays. I know maybe a handful of people who have achieved this, and René is one that I know very well and who has been here at the festival a couple of seasons. So I thought I'd give a little background on René. René went to the University of Utah, got his undergraduate degree in Salt Lake, and then went on to get his MFA at the Professional Theater Training Program at the University of Delaware, where he is now a resident company member with the Resident Ensemble Players, which is headed by Sanford Robbins, who many people in the industry may know. Sandy Robbins, who for a long time was the festival casting director here in the festival's formative years in the 80s, and directed many plays, and was also the casting director, and also was the head of this amazing program that many graduates from that program have worked at the festival. Some really star players, including René. Festival audiences may be familiar with René. Most recently, he played Orsino in Twelfth Night, as well as Henry Condell in The Book of Will. And those of you, I know, they'll get the heart for The Book of Will. Those of you that know The Book of Will by Lauren Gunderson revolves around the creation of the folio from Shakespeare's players. So I thought that would be a great segue into talking to René about what it's like to be inside this work. So I guess we'll just launch off with that. First off, let's define what this means by saying you've completed, I would say, all of Shakespeare's plays, or what we know as Shakespeare's plays. What does that mean, René?
Yeah. So when I set out, as a young actor, I thought, wouldn't it be nice one day if I had performed all of these plays? That would be amazing. So then I consider all of those plays that I thought of as Shakespeare's plays when I started out on this goal, those are the ones that count. And so all of the Shakespeare plays in folio, which if you saw Book of Will, you know how that all sort of came to be. And then I've also done Two Noble Kinsmen and Henry Condell's favorite play, Pericles, which we know from Book of Will is not in folio. There are, in the last 10 years or so, there seems to be every couple of years, a new play appears that we think Shakespeare may have had some sort of
Collaboration.
Authorship. Right? And so I haven't done those. So if you're here for an in-depth conversation about double indemnity and Edward the third, not second, then we cannot help you. I am sorry. But the rest of it, I hope that we can.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be good. I mean, let's outline that. I mean, there's essentially like, well, in the 36 plays that we know in the folio, the original folio, there were 14 comedies, 10 histories, and 12 tragedies. And the 14 comedies were, well, what we term as comedies, because some of the romances fall into both a comedy or a tragedy mode, which I'll indicate. The Tempest, which sometimes can be viewed as a romance play, but it was listed as a comedy. Two Gentlemen of Verona, Merry Wives of Windsor, Measure for Measure, The Comedy of Errors, Much Ado About Nothing, Love's Labour's Lost, A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, The Taming of the Shrew, All's Well That Ends Well, Twelfth Night, The Winter's Tale. So those are the 14 comedies. Then, of course, the 10 histories: King John, Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, Henry V, Henry VI Part 1, Henry VI Part 2, Henry VI Part 3, Richard III, and Henry VIII. Then we have the tragedies: Troilus and Cressida, Coriolanus, Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Timon of Athens, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, Antony and Cleopatra, and Cymbeline. Those will be what we list as the 36 plays in the original folio. The two plays that sort of were added later were, of course, Pericles, which Henry Condell, the passionate Henry Condell in the Book of Will, was his favorite play, which is beautiful, as well as The Two Noble Kinsmen. That's what we categorize as the 38 plays that make up essentially the complete works of Shakespeare. You have done 38 of those. You have done the 38 plays.
Yes.
So that's a cheer.
I did, so in anticipation of this conversation and with another project that I'm working on, I wanted to list all of the parts that I have played in.
Cool.
All the
Yeah.
So in the 38 plays, I have played 122 of the roles.
Wow.
And only 10 of those roles I have played more than once.
Wow. Wow.
That's amazing. And we should mention, well, the first question I would say is like, where and how did you achieve this?
Yeah.
Because
I
know handfuls of actors who have long tenures at theater companies, and they've maybe done 24, they've maybe done 28. Some of them are inching towards 36, and some of them are hard to get. They're really hard. So, I mean, where was the bulk? The bulk of these plays, where did you do them?
Well, so every single one of them I did at the American Shakespeare Center in Stanton, Virginia. Some of them
you were a company member for many years, right? I'm sorry.
I was a company there for almost 14 years. And they did, when I worked there, had a quite busy calendar. So I would be in 9 to 11 plays a year, and I was there for almost 14 years, and we did almost exclusively Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Because not only have I done all of Shakespeare, but I've done most of Marlowe's, most of Johnson's.
Yeah.
If you need a play before 1750, call me. And I had actually done some, at Utah, I did Troilus and Cressida. It was one of the first plays I did out of grad school. In my first 5 years out of grad school, I had done 3 productions of Troilus and Cressida. So
wow.
I could see that the more obscure plays seemed to be showing up in my life. And then I worked at this company that was just also trying to work its way through the canon. And so, the associate artistic director, Jane McClure, sat us down at one point and was like, tell us what you've got left, and we'll see if we can make it work in the schedule. And it took a couple of years that it did. So I actually worked with 2 other actors there, John Harrell and Allison Glenser. USF audiences might remember John Harrell from a couple seasons ago.
Yeah.
They actually completed the canon 6 months before me with production of Coriolanus. But I was still missing Henry VI Part 3 because I had taken those seasons off when the company had done them before. But then later that same year, it was on the calendar. So 6 months later, I then completed it. So it is such a rare thing to come across. And then I worked with 2 other people who also had done it.
So cool. Let me ask you, I think it's amazing because I know how how much you love these plays, just knowing that personally and our relationship. You know, I one of my favorite memories working with you was working on Cymbeline, of doing Posthumous and getting to work with you as Pisanio and in that production of Cymbeline. But I know how much you were such an advocate also for these plays and what they mean and the humanity in them and all the things. I mean, when was the first time you did Shakespeare? I mean, how old were you? What was the first?
I did my first when I was 15 in Utah. So I did, for audiences who don't know, I went to junior high and high school in Roy, Utah, and then I went to the U, as Brian mentioned. And so in Weber County School District, I don't know if it's still there, I hope it is, but there was this place up in the mountains called the Swanson Family Center, and the Swanson family had donated this sort of lodge, for lack of a better words, in the mountain that school groups would go to. And there was a couple that had a summer Shakespeare program that they would house up in this lodge every summer. And so in between my sophomore and junior year of high school, I auditioned for this production of Midsummer Night's Dream and ended up getting cast as Oberon. And that's where it started. And then I played Shylock the next summer. So I really got like trial by fire in here. And
I would say so.
And it didn't, you know, some people have that experience and they're like, I don't ever want to do that again. I had that experience and I was like, I only want to do that for the rest of my days.
Yeah, and what do you think that was? I mean, what was that you think just spoke to you as a young, you know, actor?
I mean, there are ways in which I could talk about it now that I certainly did not have the knowledge to talk about it then. I just knew that I was experiencing something different than the kinds of plays that 14-year-olds normally get to spend their time doing, you know? And I was experiencing something bigger and it was asking more of me than anything I had done up to that point. Not that I had done a ton. And I was curious about the kinds of things that I got to do. It was just, it was such a unique start that I was like, oh, I want more of these kinds of opportunities. And then as I got into college and started working on more classic plays, I was like, there's something to this language that's really speaking to me. And I want to know more about how to live with it and how to communicate it and how to share it with others, which is why I went to a grad school that was entirely based in classical theater. And I also, really from a young age, right then in my late teens and early 20s, I could look around at the industry that I wanted to go into and the kinds of roles that were available to me in contemporary theater and TV and film, I was not interested in. And in Shakespeare, I was, because I got to do all sorts of things instead of feeling like I was getting pigeonholed into a very narrow window.
Right.
Cool.
And I mean, I guess, you know, you mentioned the play. What are the plays that you have revisited more than others? You know, I mean, the fact that you've done 3 productions of Troilus and Cressida is sort of like, my mind's blown on that because
and yet only
you got to
one.
bring it back, man. It's
yes.
coming back.
that there have been 3 productions.
I've actually done 4 productions of Troilus and Cressida. Those were just the first 3. Romeo and Juliet is of course, I've done 7 Romeo and Juliets. There are now a couple others hanging around at 6, but Romeo and Juliet is the winner, which is also a play that I had done at the Utah Shakespeare Festival.
Yeah, for sure.
First play I did at the Utah Shakespeare Festival, actually.
I mean, and I guess what I love too is I know that, you know, you've also played some of these giants in the canon. You know, I know you've played King Lear, right? And Timon. You mentioned Shylock. I mean, these are very large roles, complex. I mean, what is the when you look at it, you know, when you take your 10,000 foot view of all of your work and everything, and I mean, there's got to have been like ebbs and flows of like the smaller roles and then the larger roles. What is your approach to each of them, and what were the differences between being inside of those two, you know, I guess the size of those plays?
It's funny because on some level, I have often found that those smaller roles are harder than the larger roles. You know, one of the reasons why I love Shakespeare so much, as opposed to sort of contemporary language is that everything you need to know is right there on the page in front of you. It makes my job way much easier. I just have to do what's on the page in front of me. Great. And those smaller roles are harder because there's less on the page in front of you. So you have to do sort of more work to answer questions and create around that. But diving, it's one of the reasons I was so much looking forward to playing Gower again this summer for you in Utah, because those epic speeches are just so fun to get inside of and figure out how to stretch and pull and make the language live and dance in interesting, engaging ways. And that's what working with Shakespeare gives me the opportunity to do, is to challenge myself to increase the level and power of my communication in ways that I find contemporary dialogue often doesn't.
Yeah, that was something I was going to talk about, because you've obviously done more than Shakespeare, and that's one of the, I see you as a true Renaissance man in the sense that you can, I know you do musicals, I know you've done a lot of contemporary plays, you've done a lot of comedy, tragedy. Your work at the Rep now in Delaware is that idea, classical theater, diving in and out of styles and forms and all of that. Do you, there's an adage that if you can do Shakespeare and you can do it well, you can kind of do anything, do you subscribe to that?
I believe whoever said that did not spend their life doing Shakespeare and then try to do other things. That is what I think about whoever came up with that saying.
Yeah.
I have found, the last couple of years since leaving the ASC, with the exception of my summer in Utah and the summer before at the Old Globe in San Diego, I've been mostly hanging out with plays written in the 20th century and the 21st century. My God, I actually did a brand new play this year. What a wonder. And it's hard. I find it a lot harder.
Why? Define that. Why is contemporary, because I agree with you, why is it harder than Shakespeare?
Well, if I need to communicate something to someone in a Shakespeare play, Shakespeare's going to give me 10 sentences to get the specificity of what I am trying to say across to you. Mm-hmm. A contemporary playwright is going to give me 6 words that I'm going to have to give our life history in the sort of subtext of those 6 words in a way that I don't have to in a Shakespeare play.
Do you think that analysis of having worked on Shakespeare, though, because there is a lot of analysis that goes into doing these plays, where you go through and you look at every word and you look at punctuation and long thoughts, parenthetical phrases, all this stuff. Do you think all of that work on that informs the approach to the contemporary work, where you are going, what is underneath what I'm saying here? What is the simplicity of this four-word line that?
Well, and I now have directors saying things to me like, you can just toss that line away.
Right.
What? The words are precious. They cannot be tossed away.
Yeah, but at the same time, that playwright has strived to make that punctuation what that punctuation is, a lot of times. And do you feel like knowing that informs how you look at that? Because that's also Shakespeare of going, well.
Yeah, I'm very sensitive to how something looks on a page. Mm-hmm. And so modern playwrights, I did Doll's House Part 2, and Lucas Knapp wrote that play like a verse play. And if you look at it on the page, it looks like a verse play. And so I actually was able to respond really well to that because the format made sense to my brain. But I really do struggle with it, and people think it's ridiculous, but I find contemporary language harder to memorize because the form and structure is not quite the same, and my brain is just tuned to that verse form, and so those lines just kind of flow right up.
Can you take us through your journey, a little bit about your relationship with verse and scansion? In other words, what it was like when you were 16. Then you went to University of Utah, and there was also focus on scansion. And then all of a sudden, and then something happens in the game when it becomes, I'm going to say second nature. Can you tell us about your journey with that? And when you began to say, oh, this is a trick he's doing here in Measure for Measure. Oh, I've seen the same trick in Tempest. I've seen this same trick over in Allswell. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with scansion and verse and how that's a tool.
I mean, it is a tool, and to me, it's the biggest and best tool. You just said that thing about how it at some point became second nature, and I don't know that I could pinpoint for you when that happened, but yes, there definitely, and this is a bit of a dangerous thing to say because I understand that all of the work that I did before then got me to this point.
Right.
But I very rarely consider scansion these days in that way, in the way that I used to, partly just because I've heard these so much, and because it is sort of internalized to be a bit. And so for me, now in my toolkit, I use scansion for when a line doesn't make sense, when I can't understand, I'm like, what, those words don't make sense. Then I'm like, okay, René, go back to the scansion. Okay.
Otherwise, it's just second nature, right?
Yeah, which sounds weird to say, but it's true, just from having done it so much.
Well, and the natural cadence of that rhythm.
Right, your heartbeat. So
the heartbeat of that, you begin to sort of, it becomes just part of your DNA, as you're looking at it.
And what is also true is that once I got more comfortable with it, once I got more comfortable with the rhythms that he wrote, I then felt freedom to play with them. And to not feel imprisoned by them, but to be supported by them as an opportunity to play.
Yeah.
How did and because I know a little bit of your past and how ASC works, how did the Actors Renaissance season help inform that? Did that help that? Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, it's one thing to be in a play where another director is telling you what to do, and it's another thing to, and just share a little bit about that, because I think that laboratory also helped.
100%. So for people who don't know, one of the things that the American Shakespeare Center did was they had the season called the Actors Renaissance season, where we would do a rep of 5 plays with 12 to 14 actors. And the whole sort of ideology of the ASC was recreating the circumstances that Shakespeare's company worked in and seeing what we can learn about plays today using those conditions. And for the Actors Renaissance season, the experiment got taken even a step further, and we had no directors, no designers, nobody. Though, what I also have to make sure to say when I say no designers, we, however, used designers' works because we would raid the costume storage. And so you would see a sort of parade of one show had 5 designers as opposed to just the one costume designer. But yeah, having that responsibility of I'll tell you when the turning point was for me, especially when it comes to like Shakespeare's epic speeches. Because I played Pericles in the Renaissance season, so without a director, sort of trying to muddle my way through that. And that was a whole huge undertaking. And then the next year I played, which isn't actually Shakespeare, but I played Aeneas in Marlowe's Dido, Queen of Carthage. And he has the longest speech I have ever come across in a play, where he, in Shakespeare, in Hamlet, Shakespeare talks about Aeneas's tale to Dido.
Yeah.
And in Dido, you actually hear Aeneas's tale to Dido. And it's a speech that was almost 200 lines long in the middle of the play with like 10 other people on stage and no director. And so I spent hours and hours and hours in the rehearsal room by myself, trying to figure out how to stage this like epic speech and how to make the story interesting and engaging and like not lose everybody and make everybody fall asleep 1 second into it. My work changed. That role and that speech changed how my work went, because I learned what it was going to be required of me to do those kinds of parts. And so then when I got back to whatever Shakespeare role it was I did next, I came at it with a new new vigor.
Oh,
Yeah. I mean, were there roles that surprised you, you know, that you went, oh, I went into this maybe doing, you know, either looking at it going, oh, this will be what it is. And then it, you know, once you got inside it, that it was, you realized it was more pivotal or monumental for you? Or were there any that just surprised you, either challenging or fulfilling, you know?
Yeah, I mean, they're all challenging sort of in their own ways. And some you're like, that looks like it's going to be challenging. And then you're in it and you're like, yeah, turns out it was. Was there, what's only coming to mind right now, and I don't know why, but I remember playing Antonio in The Merchant of Venice and being so surprised by how much it affected me in my everyday life. Like, I'm not the kind of person who like taking my work home, and you know, usually pretty good about separating life and art. But something about the sadness that he carries around with him really started to drag me down. And like, that was a rough 6 months for me because Antonio was a bummer and he was dragging me down with him.
Yeah.
I did not see that coming in any way at all.
Right.
Cool.
It is amazing how they do that. You know what I mean? That sometimes you'll be blinded by something. Or, I mean, have you ever had those moments where you feel like your own life is sort of really falling in line with what's happening with the character, that like where you are in your, that period in your life, whether it's your age or relationships or, you know, education, whatever that is, that you found like a parallel where you're like, wow, this is really where I am right now. Have you had that?
I mean, age is an interesting one because I in my first encounters with The Tempest, I did not like it. It just didn't speak to me. Wasn't into it. And I used to say when I was younger, I kind of feel like The Tempest is a play you need to be older to get. At least I needed to be older to get. And now that I am older, I absolutely get it, and I love it so much. But you know, to understand regret, to understand holding regret, and revenge, that kind of revenge, takes some life experience behind you that you don't get quite when you're 19.
Right.
We're going to be getting some questions shortly, so I want those of you that are watching on Facebook land, at about 10:40, we're going to start launching with questions. Thank you for the questions that you've already posted, and we'll be doing those shortly. I have always been intrigued with the way you communicate with an audience. I think your training is really, really fabulous and supportive of that training with an audience. Do you want to talk a little bit about Shakespeare's relationship with the audience, particularly in those, I mean, how did you make that 200-line speech come alive? Does it have to do with Shakespeare? Well, I guess that was Marlowe, but what is it about René on stage and the way he connects with an audience, and how has Shakespeare and your training in Shakespeare informed the way you communicate directly with an audience? You understand what I'm asking there?
Yes, I think. My training is such a huge part of what the actor I turned out to be. The training that both my undergrad and my graduate school training were so textually based and so about supporting the language and about communication. And ultimately it's about communication. And it's also funny because, so I wasn't trained in a school of thought that had anything to do with fourth walls and disappearing and things like that. That's just not how my training works. And I'm not passing judgment on that, because one of the things I think is amazing about acting is that there's as many different people as there are in the world. There are paths into acting. And if it works for you, great, then continue to do that. For me, there's no pretense that we are not all standing or sitting in the same room and creating this thing together. And that I'm super clear that I can't do what I am doing without the audience's participation in it. And it's one of the things why I love doing theater, is because I get to help create communities for a living. And that's a pretty great way to spend your life or at least for me, at least. And so I am just super clear that my purpose here is for these people who are watching, and that we are all doing this together. And so in order for them to help me, I've got to make sure that they know what's going on every single step of the way.
Cool.
And that they're still paying attention every single step of the way. You know, we all know what it's like when you are sitting at something and then your mind starts to drift and you're thinking about, well, where are we going to go for drinks after? Or tomorrow we've got to get up early to pack because we've got to go back home. And, you know, there's a lot. The human brain is a beast that needs taming. And so I feel like part of my job as an actor is to sort of corral the minds of the audience so that we all can sort of focus in on this one thing for the next 2 hours.
Cool.
Do you have one that you want to do again, that you're just like clamoring, I got to do that again?
Yeah, I mean, there's several I would love to do.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I mean, I would love another shot at Brutus in Caesar, because that play happened very quickly. You know, we were just talking about this actor Renaissance season. One of the other things that was part of that season was very short rehearsal periods. And so I was playing Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. We closed on Sunday. I started rehearsals for Julius Caesar on Tuesday. On Thursday night, we had a dress rehearsal. On Friday night, we had a preview. And on Saturday, we opened. And then started rehearsals for
Actor nightmare
the next day.
I have friends, though, that say they saw that show and that was one of the most compelling Caesars they have ever seen.
That's very sweet.
I'll do a shout out to Sarah Enlow, but they talked about that production. It was still, so there's something about that, you know, Shakespeare threw the plays up that quickly. There's something that happens that makes, you know, the catalyst and crucible for creativity through there.
Well, at the end of the day, you're going to be on stage in front of people. So you might as well just sort of like throw yourself into it and see what happens, or drown. Like those are the options. So you're going to sing. I would love another shot. You know, Winter's Tale is one of my favorites, and I would love another shot at Leontes. I obviously would love to play Lear again, especially as I continue to get older. Timon is probably my favorite that I've had an opportunity to play, and I would love to have another chance at it, because I feel like that play gets a bad rap, and I will die on a hill for talking about this, because I think it's a great.
We were just talking about that, weren't we, Michael?
Talking about that. Bring it back, man. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so fascinating to me too, because you're so young. I mean, I mean, I know we're similar ages, but I mean, I see you as a very young actor, and I mean, not very young, but young in the sense. No, I mean, you know, young in the, like, I don't like Lear. You could do 10. You got 8 more Lears with you. You know what I mean?
Lears in you.
Like knowing that you've done that, knowing you've done it at a young age, you know, and that there's more ahead of you. That's why I asked, because that's another thing that's really great about this work, is that you do get to revisit some of these plays.
Absolutely, and they start to speak to you differently, and they resonate in different ways, and it's fun to see how different people interact with them, and how that changes the productions and performances of them. I was certainly getting a little burnt out towards the end of my time at the ASC, just because it was like all Shakespeare, I mean, it's what had been done basically for the entirety of my career. But now that I've had some time away from all Shakespeare all the time, I'm ready to go back.
Yeah.
I've wanted to ask, I can't believe I haven't asked you this question before. We just came out of a teacher's class, and I have my own answer for this question, but in 1896, they came up with the term problem plays, Shakespeare's problem plays. So do you believe that there's such thing as, quote, a problem play? And how do you, as a modern classically trained actor, what do you do with that title, Shakespeare's Problem Plays?
I don't use it. I mean, it's funny because like the plays of Shakespeare's that I think are most problematic are not the ones that get as problem plays.
Those are the good ones.
Yeah, they are. The tragic
And
comedy
for
is
the audience sake, they said Troilus and Cressida. You've done it 4 times, so obviously love it. Measure for Measure and All's Well, which for me are just incredible. We're the ones with the problem. Have no problem. Just because you don't know how to, it doesn't tie up in a sweet Victorian knot.
Right.
So,
well, and what is also true is that Shakespeare's tragedies are funny, and Shakespeare's comedies have real heart in them. So these categorizations are scholars later. I don't think they were his categorizations. He was just writing well-crafted stories.
Yeah.
Cool.
I have a couple questions I want to get to, Renee, if that's okay. Sarah asks, in your opinion, when introducing my fellow 20 to 30-year-olds to Shakespeare outside of their high school exposure, what play would you recommend? She usually goes to Midsummer, but
Midsummer Night's Dream is literally the words about to come out of my mouth. It is actually like, I have gotten a little in trouble saying this out loud before, but I will say it again because I do believe it. I wish that, and I know teachers don't have a ton of control over what plays end up in their curriculum, but I sure do wish Julius Caesar was not a play that we were trying to teach people in junior high.
Right.
Like Julius Caesar's just not beginner Shakespeare. That's
right.
a hard play.
Yeah.
That is not, like if you want to get people excited and interested in Shakespeare, read A Midsummer Night's Dream. I mean, just start there. Like that'll get you there.
Are there others? Are there others? I mean, you did Merchant of Venice, and it still got you.
It did, yes. But I was super into that, like heavy drama, even at a young age. I think Twelfth Night is. I think it's interesting to me that we teach the tragedies when I think the comedies are probably an easier intro.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them, but All's Well is probably not a great intro play either.
Well, I love that you mentioned Midsummer because I think it's so original. I mean, like the idea in itself is like, and that it's acting on all these different levels, and and I mean, if you're like me, you've seen many productions of A Midsummer. Some fare better than others.
Productions of it.
Yeah, but they all are. They just capture imagination and what that means, and and the idea of love and all these things that are so rich.
Some of my best memories of my experience in my career as an actor are audiences for productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is just such a collective good time. Yeah. And it's great to be the cause and participant in that kind of energy.
Yeah.
I love that play. I know it's, popularity breeds contempt. And so like Midsummer and Romeo and Juliet get a lot of sort of placed on top of them, but I love them both.
Cool.
Okay. This is a good question here.
Yes.
Ariani, I might be saying that right, or Ariane, I'm probably saying it completely. I apologize. Of all the Shakespeare characters you've played, whose actions did you find the most difficult to justify?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Oh. That's a good
one. I
know. Cursing someone's womb was not a good time.
Wow.
Lear curses Goneril's womb. And like that, I had a hard time with that.
Right.
Cool. That's the very first thing that comes to mind. I'm sure there are others. I'm like, well, I have killed people on stage, but like, I mean, I played all of the Richards before he gets to Richard III, and he obviously makes some questionable choices, but they make sense for who he is as a person. And so like, you should kind of run with it. But the very first thing to come to mind is that moment in Lear. I used to, before we started that show, as we were waiting backstage, I hugged all 3 of the women.
Wow.
because I knew I was about to treat them all very poorly. And so I had to do that so that I could be comfortable doing the rest.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Michael. You got it. You got it.
Say, what do you suggest for an actor who has the same dream of performing the Canon? What advice would you give?
Just start doing them. You know, it's funny because like whenever somebody's interested in theater or in Shakespeare, you'd say, well, see as much of it as you can. But now we live here, and so I don't know that that's as much of an option anymore, although there's certainly plenty of varieties of filmed versions of these plays. I had a goal, but I didn't have a clear plan or path as to how I was going to achieve that.
You did think that. I mean, you came out of grad school and said, "I'm going to play in all of Shakespeare's play." I mean, that was
even before. I mean, even when I was an undergrad, like I just knew it was something I wanted.
I guess that's the first step, saying, "Yep, I'm going to do this."
Yeah. So. I knew it was something I wanted, but I didn't actually think that it would happen. But it seemed like a goal that would sustain me for longer than it ended up actually sustaining me. I thought I would be in my 60s before I could even come close to achieving it.
Thank you, Hannah, for that question. We have another question from Liz, who has faithfully been watching all of our virtual seminars. And
thank you, Liz.
She works with second graders.
Okay.
And what role have you played in Macbeth? Roles have you played in Macbeth? And how do you feel about second graders taking on an adaptation of that play?
Wow. I have played Bloody Captain, Banquo, Old Seward, Macduff. There's somebody else in there somewhere. Though Macbeth is high on my list of parts that I have not played that I would like to, along with Antony and Cleopatra. I mean, sure, why not? You know, I have not worked with a lot of kids, and so I don't, especially kids these days, I don't know what they can handle and what they can't handle. Obviously, Macbeth deals with some pretty dark stuff. And so if you have a way to get 8-year-olds into that without damaging them psychologically, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, I mean, the content is definitely...
it is, the context is important, and it's true. It's one of the things that's funny about Shakespeare is that some of it is dark and some of it is dirty, and like that's just how it is, and we don't always relate to him in that way. And I think it's interesting that we teach Romeo and Juliet to junior high school students, when if you actually look at some of the things that get said and done in the course of Romeo and Juliet, you might reconsider that position.
I use that almost always as an example when people are like, "Oh, that play, it was just like a little bit too dirty for me," and then but it's okay to go see Merry Wives, And I'm like, that's some of the nastiest lines written, and I look at that and I go, "Whoa!"
If you're laughing, it's somehow okay.
Right? Yeah.
I think this question from Mary ties into what you're talking about. So Mary says, as an artist, this is a deep one. What have you been thinking about during current events, global and national, that you have learned from Shakespeare?
Yeah.
That I have learned from Shakespeare. That's interesting. I don't know, to be honest. I haven't really been thinking about Shakespeare that much as of late, because I haven't had the opportunity to do him. I mean, there are certainly models to be found in Shakespeare about people uprising and people in positions of power, people abusing positions of power, people taking a stand for themselves. Those are all things that Shakespeare is riddled with, and of examples of it being effective and less effective are in there as well.
That kind of brings me to my question too, René, that I mean, do you think these plays are worth redoing, mining, reevaluating? I mean, I have my own answer for that, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that as far as the work,
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are. because I love them. So totally selfishly, I think that they are. Because one of the things that I think is extraordinary about what Shakespeare did was capture humanity on a level that it applies to all. What I think we are in a position to do now is, and one of the things I see happening with like what the festival's schedule was this summer, is connecting Shakespeare's voice with contemporary voices, right? So I do think there is value on working on these plays. I do think there's a value in performing these plays. I mean, I am only the actor I am today because Shakespeare taught me to be the actor that I am today. But I think we also are in a place here in the 21st century where we need to make space for other voices to join his, right? And so like, come for A Midsummer Night's Dream, but stay for something else.
Yeah.
Right? And so what I think there's probably more balance to be found in is that we've had a lot of our history where Shakespeare is the prominent voice. And now in the 21st century, there's just room to make room for other voices, because the theater is only going to be better when it includes more voices.
That's fantastic. And Mindy asks, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, but I would love for you to take this question in the context of what you just said. How has your involvement with Shakespeare informed or influenced your work with other playwrights? So you kind of talked about, the difference between that, but how does that work with Shakespeare kind of amplify, or can it amplify those other voices that we need to hear within the theater?
Wait, say that last bit again.
That was me. That was me destroying Mindy's question there. How does it do what you just said? How does Shakespeare help amplify the other voices that we need to hear within the theater?
Well, I think that happens by having other voices do Shakespeare, is how that happens. One of the lessons that I have learned, not just in the last 2 months, certainly in my whole life, but one of the things I'm now certain about is that I'm not interested in going to rehearse a Shakespeare play anywhere where I am the only person of color in the room. That is just not a thing that I have any interest in doing. I've already done all the plays, so I no longer have the need to do them be what carries me through. Now I have a different point of view about them, and I'm interested in productions of his plays that are supported, lifted, celebrated, pulled apart, examined by people from all walks of life, cultural backgrounds, religious creeds.
Cool.
Yeah, that's beautifully well put, I think. And like I love the way you said about the idea of like, how those plays, they were written for a contemporary audience during that time. They were written for that time period, reflecting obviously some of them historically, some of them about other subject matter, and pulling source material from other sources that he was doing, but they were written for a contemporary audience. And now it's sort of like having a contemporary lens alongside that thing that we've been holding up for over 400 years or whatever, as an indication of our true reflection of humanity, needs to also be merged into a contemporary lens. You know what I mean? But both with playwrights and with people performing them, so I think that's beautifully well put and necessary too.
John Michael asks, when you revisit a role, do you carry things over from a previous performance or role, or do you start from scratch?
Oh, no, I steal liberally. I 100% steal things that I've seen other actors do with the role. One of the reasons, one of the things that was interesting to me in my sort of post-ASC life was finding myself in rehearsal rooms for Shakespeare plays and kind of getting a little frustrated, because I was like, René, how many times in your life are you going to sit in the room and watch people reinvent the wheel?
Huh.
right? Because some of the questions that come up are the same questions that come up in every single production of that play.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you're sitting in a rehearsal for Much Ado About Nothing, and you're like, I have heard this exact same conversation so very many times.
So how do you...
But that said, like, it's interesting when someone comes up with a new answer. That's exciting. And, you know, and also the plus of that is that I feel like one of the things that I can bring to the table is, you know, if I'm going to work on a production of Romeo and Juliet with you, then like, I'm going to bring a bunch of, I am a resource for Romeo and Juliet that I hope you use, because I'm going to bring that to the table.
Yeah. Cool.
Yes, you probably have it all memorized. You probably have it all. Seriously, I mean, like,
I might actually have.
I know. I'm pretty confident you could play any part in the play right now.
People think that because I've done all the plays, they then interpret that into like, I've done all the roles somehow. And so people are constantly like, oh, René, what's that line when so-and-so, I don't know. I didn't play that part. I don't know. And even if I did play that part, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, some of them are so familiar too. I mean, like some of them, like you hear a line, you go, wow, that's from Hamlet. No, that's not. That's Posthumous from Cymbeline. This is some sort of archetype. Yes. This is a good question. I think, Sarah, as an aspiring playwright, what is the biggest lesson about language that I can learn from Shakespeare?
I mean, for me, one of the beautiful things about his writing is that he's not afraid of language, right? Like he clearly felt like he was the master of it, and that he could use it in any way that he wanted to. And if he needed something to make sense in a moment and there wasn't a word that did that, then he made up the word to do that, and we now use those words today. So like, you know, so there must have been a freedom. He must have felt some sort of freedom inside of that to use language the way that made sense to him. So, I mean, I'm not a playwright, so I don't know what playwrights do. But
no, I love that though. I mean, I think of that like with rhyming verse. You know, like some people are like, oh, we can't make it rhyme. I got to lean off the rhyme, and it's like, I think you might probably put that rhyme in there to make a rhyme. Make a rhyme. Audiences probably really love it, so really hit it. You know.
And when you hear great rhyme, I mean, is there any? The ear just sings. I love listening to great rhyme. I love it.
Yeah. We always get these amazing questions right at the end. So we could have done the whole hour about this. So thanks, Chris. My high school advanced drama students did a survey of acting techniques last year. Stanislavski, Meisner, Adler, Hagen, Suzuki, Boll, Strasberg. What techniques do you use, and do you find that some work better or worse with Shakespeare?
I use all of them, to be honest. I feel very fortunate in that both of my undergraduate training and my graduate school training were very eclectic. It was not in one specific school. What I love about that is that then, now in my professional life in the 20 plus years since then, is I can cherry pick what makes sense for me. Mm-hmm. And so I use a little bit of this here and a little bit of that there and a little bit of this, you know. And I love that I've had that exposure to so many different styles. And if this is a thing that you are considering doing with your life, I would suggest opening yourself or investigating all the different styles, because one might speak to you personally more than another. Mm-hmm. Like, I loved Suzuki work and hated it, but there are elements of the strength that it taught me that I still use on stage today. And it has been over 20 years since the last time I was in a Suzuki class. But other people hated Suzuki, and the second they had nothing to do with that again, they didn't, right? So it's just gonna all speak to people differently. And for me, I definitely, it's a very eclectic And now I just even sort of consider it as my own.
Cool. We've kind of alluded to this. There might be another specific you can bring up. Adrian asks, how has your experience of a play changed over multiple times doing it? So, you do Troilus and Cressida 4 times. What happens when you come back to it, number 4?
You start to get very convinced that you have the answers as part of what
everybody's looking to you for the answer.
Yeah, maybe someday I'll start directing these plays and put these theories of mine to the test. The thing that excites me the most about when I come to these again now is when I hear lines in new ways, right? Or when you see an actor, when you see a moment that you struggled with when you were playing it and you see someone else playing it and you're like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. Why did I not see that? And sometimes it's terrifying. I'll get to a script that I've worked with before and I'm looking at it and I'm like, how did I miss this? Like, how did I not know this 10 years ago when I first came to this play? And apologies to those audiences that had to watch that. But it's a learning process, right? It's a learning, growing process, the whole thing.
Cool.
Do you find that, like, because I've noticed this sometimes in auditions, like, do you find when you hear someone in the first few minutes or not even minutes, but first few lines of a speech, if they understand what they're saying or not?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that goes back to your knowledge of having done them so much. The sort of nature of it becomes part of your DNA, where you can recognize, well, they grasp what might be.
And sort of the downside is I had a director say to me once, I need you to be clear to me when you don't understand what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Because you're so experienced with it, it sounds like you do understand what you're saying. So if you don't, I need you to tell me that. I was like, okay. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. And it's super important. And
can you remove yourself from that when you're watching a play?
No, it's funny. I was just talking with a friend earlier today about how difficult it is for me to watch plays in a way that it isn't for TV and film. But I can be a great audience member and I can be a terrible audience member. It just depends on the show. But it's hard to turn that part of your brain off when you've spent so much of your life like examining something and picking it apart and to then it's hard for me to turn that part of my brain off and just like be audience member. I wish I could sometimes. Sometimes it takes the fun out of it.
We're getting close. I'm going to ask this question from Keith, and then there will be a closing question that Brian and I can give to you before we go. But you get this question as an actor all the time. I know because we hear it in the seminar goes frequently. What is your process of memorization? And people tend to think that that's a hard part or that type of stuff. So what do you do to memorize? What do you do when you're faced with those 200 lines from Marlowe?
Well, first I cry. And then repetition. I mean, that's for me, it's a big one. It is funny because that is a question that gets asked all the time. And, part of me is like, it is a very difficult element of what we do, but it's not, to me, the most interesting part of what we do. So it's funny to me that it's all like literally the first question that people will ask so much of the time. Mm-hmm. And I often will say, like, if you go to your tax person and they start pulling out forms and they know this, and they got it all memorized because it's just their job and what they do, and you don't even really think twice about it. That's kind of how I feel about it. And it's just part of what I do comes with memorizing lines, and it's the most basic. And if you can't do that, you can't do the rest of what we do. Although some people still have managed to do that. But yeah, for me, it's just repetition, and then I will often work on lines. Like some folks in Cedar City certainly saw me on the treadmill at the gym working on lines because the one way to make the treadmill bearable to me is to have lines to learn while I am on it. So
that is a special thing here in Cedar City. I love actors, and I usually you can spot them just walking around town where you're like, oh, there's an actor, because I can see them talking to themselves walking with their headphones on, or they're at the gym.
classmates in grad school had campus police called on him because he was rehearsing a monologue outside on the lawn and someone got scared.
Oh yeah, totally. Also, Feldman, when he played Mozart, I remember seeing him, and he was kind of like, he'd be walking and conducting, and I was like, of course he's doing that, of course. It's just, that's what you do. You just
talk to myself in public all the time. I'll be sitting at a restaurant, like writing over lines. It's like, if it bothers you, I'm sorry, but that's how I get my life done.
Yeah.
Brian, I really loved your last question that you had. And I think that's a really great one to close with. Do you remember it? Or?
Yeah. Just what kind of advice would you give young people starting out, René? One of the things I love that you said is that there's no one way to approaching this work, that everybody uses what's in their own toolbox and all of that. I love that, because that's what makes us individuals, and what works for someone may not work for another person. But
I could just interject for a second there. It's also what makes us artists. Like, to me, that's what makes it an art, because you are taking the sum total of the collection of experiences that you've had in your own life and finding a way to infuse someone else's life with that and bring all of that alive on stage. Like, that's the art of it. And there are other careers that have just clearer pathways, right? Like, you go to this, and you go to this school, and then you do this, and then this, and now you have this job, hopefully.
Yeah.
Not in today's
Well,
job.
and that idea, even the sort of rules of Shakespeare that people say, well, there are rules, and it's like, well, some rules are meant to be broken sometimes. You know what I mean?
And guidelines, perhaps, instead of rules.
Yeah. No, I think sometimes what works for someone else, another person might not be adhering to, and they're amazing, unbelievably dialed in to whatever it is, and so it is impossible to follow any one given course. But do you have some?
I worked with students who were young and coming to Shakespeare for the first time, and for whatever reason, like, it computes in their brain, and they're like doing a monologue, and I'm like, how are you that good at that? At 16 years old. I was nowhere near that good when I was 16 years old. I don't understand how you did that. And they've had no training at all. And then other people can take all the classes and study all the scantia.
Yeah.
I'm still here.
Yes.
I really do think that experience is the best teacher.
Cool.
It was for me. I learned so much in undergrad, but I needed to go to grad school because I still didn't understand how I was going to be an actor out in the world with the tools that I had available to me at the time. So then I got more experience, and then I had a bunch of tools that I still didn't quite know how I was going to make a life as an actor with those tools afterwards. But I had the tools in my toolkit, and then it just became about trying to get work to put those tools into practice. And there are things that I think now about acting that I did not think 20 years ago, and there are things that are in direct contradiction of what I thought 20 years ago, as a matter of fact. And so I would just encourage you, if your theater is a thing that you're interested in, and Shakespeare is interesting, you're interested in, read them. In these days of Zoom, get your friends together and read a play over Zoom. That's a great way for you all to hang out. And you get to sort of learn and experience these plays, and you'll find some that will speak to you, and you'll find some that will not speak to you, and that's okay. I do not love them all. I do not think that they are all equally incredible, so it's okay. But, exposure and experience.
Cool.
Love it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very, 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 very much. A couple last things we want to say. Again, we're grateful to our sponsor, Cedar City Bryan Head and Tourism Bureau. Grateful for that sponsorship. We're grateful for those of you that have made gifts to keep the Utah Shakespeare Festival alive. Thank you for that. And we want those of you, the rest of you, to know that there are still opportunities to give. And I would recommend, and Brian, you said this very, very well before we went on camera. There are arts organizations that are struggling at this time all around you. So whatever position you're in, if you can give to any of your local groups, Utah Shakespeare Festival or others. Brian, as you were talking before, I mean, we appreciate those that have given thus far, and the Phoenix will rise again. You will see us all on stages again, but it's your gifts that make those happen.
Absolutely. I mean, as everyone knows, it's a challenging time for the American theater right now. And so I say support artists, support theater companies if you can, any performing arts company, ballet, symphony, small theater, large theater, everyone needs a helping hand right now. So just keep that in mind and keep your hearts alive for the performing arts, because it is a vital necessity. And I look forward to the day when we're all back together and we can do it, because nothing compares to being in front of, experiencing something live and in the moment together as a group. And it will happen. You're right, Michael. The Phoenix will rise. Thank you, Renee. You're amazing. I'm sure our audience loves seeing you.
Thank you for watching. I hope that was...
Oh, it was fantastic. We're so grateful. Thank you for your comments on Facebook. You can watch all of these. We put them on our website. They're on the first site. You go down to virtual programming. You can catch them that way. You can recommend it to your friends, and you can watch it on YouTube. And tomorrow, join us at 1 o'clock when the great Tanya Searle, who is the Renee's worked with Tanya. We all have. And she will be talking about stage management, those great gods and goddesses that keep us all together. And so that will be tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And a week from now, we'll be also talking to dramaturgs. So thank you very, very much. And God bless all. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Renee.
Thank you.